Hello, and welcome to the Biomass Magazine podcast. I'm your host, Anna Simet. I hope you're all doing well. Today, I have with me none other than Rudi Roeslein, founder of Roeslein Alternative Energy, which, if you are in the RNG space at all, you've certainly heard of. Rudi, hello, and welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you, Anna. I really appreciate you having me and letting me tell my story.
Yeah, I'm super excited. And, Rudi, I have to tell you, I've been working at my company, BBI International, for nearly 17 years. And the first feature article that I ever wrote fresh out of college was about your company. And it was called The Mystery of Modularization. So kind of cheesy, but I'll never forget that.
Yeah, that's it. That's interesting because, that's really I guess my claim to fame, and around the world, we've built these amazing systems in can making. Not very many people really appreciate when they pick up a beverage can. It's actually rocket science. I mean, the tolerance on the upper end of a can is plus or minus 2/10,000s. And we make cans now after almost 35, 40 years of innovation at 3,000 a minute. So think about that.
Wow.
At 50 cans a second, are coming off our lines. And, we've been able to take American technology when everybody was leaving and lamenting how we couldn't compete. And I said, sure we can. We just have to give our people the right motivation and the right tools. And we build these modular systems in our factories, and I shipped them over 60 countries and over 700 systems around the world for the last 35 years.
Wow.
So it's an amazing story of, how people can innovate and be very competitive, and with a little bit of help from some of the regulations around the world, we've been able to justify building things in the U.S. and shipping them everywhere.
Mm-hmm. So I think that's a great start, Rudi. Why don't we continue with having you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and your background?
Well, I have to say, I'm one of these people that looks at things in a very humble way. First of all, I'm just so grateful to have been able to immigrate to this country and have the opportunities at this country that I have. I grew up in Salzburg, Austria till the age of 8, moving from displacement camp to displacement camp. My parents were Yugoslav Germans, and after World War II, things in Yugoslavia got really ugly. And my mother and her siblings were put on a train by her dad, Rudolph, and she was told that he'd see him in a few months, but she never saw him again.
Wow.
I don't want to get into the gory details of what happened, but there's a tremendous amount of Germans that were shipped off to Russia or they were executed. My grandfather, John Roeslein, was in a prison camp until 1952 because he was German. My grandmothers were nearly starved to death in displacement camps. And so it's a tragic story that I think is being repeated right now in the Ukraine, and I'm really concerned about what's going to happen to the people that are already behind the Russian lines. And there's a history of that is pretty ugly.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm diverging a little bit, and I had the good fortune of coming here. I grew up in South St. Louis. Everybody worked. My grandfather worked. I started working at age 13. My grandmother worked as a cleaning lady downtown, and my mom worked as a seamstress, and we truly lived, what most immigrants do. They will come here, they work really hard, and they believe that the opportunities they've been given are special. And I've always felt that. I make no excuses. I always say, we have to get things done. You can't make excuses. But along the way, I had the good fortune of going to St. Louis University, and I tell people that I kind of went there because of soccer. I thought I was going to be a professional soccer player, and I was taking engineering as a sideline, and somehow magically I graduated because along the way I figured out I wasn't really that good at soccer, and they weren't paying that much money, $75 a game if you played. Mm-hmm. So I didn't need differential equations to figure out I couldn't raise a family on that. So fortunately, I got my engineering degree in electrical engineering, and I went to work for a packaging company called Container Corporation of America. And I learned very quickly from the guy that mentored me that, we're always going to need food. And if you have food, you need packaging. And that's how somehow I got involved in, ultimately in beverage industry and packaging through the long evolution. But anyway, along the way, I devised and invented these modular systems so that I could really predict very quickly how long it took to install our projects, because I was going around the country for our company and installing equipment that we built. And oftentimes it didn't work exactly the way we thought. So it was taking longer, costing a lot more money. And I didn't like it because it was embarrassing me. So I finally convinced my boss that we should build the entire systems in our facility and run them and then install them. And that kind of led to the early concepts of modularization that you were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
And eventually I had an opportunity to do that in the aluminum beverage can industry. And I went to work. I left Container and I went to work for a company called Guarantee Electric that had a division, Guarantee Instrument Systems in Missouri. And as an electrical engineer, I designed a lot of systems for power plants, even nuclear power plants, chemical plants, breweries. But my love was still in packaging. So I got an opportunity to build the very first aluminum can modular system that went to Maracay, Venezuela in 1978. And from there, I started building systems that were going all over the country, but also our first opportunity was with Ball Corporation in 1985 to Guangzhou, China. And we built 85% of everything of that facility in St. Louis, shipped it to China, installed it, and started operating it. And for 3 years in a row, that thing received the most profitable joint venture in China, and it kind of led to my long-term relationship with Ball. I went to work briefly for a conveying company because I believe everything in continuous process is all about how you move from one step to the next and the accumulation between each of these so that you can account for the mean time between failure and the mean time to repair and not stop the entire systems. And that led to eventually, a couple of years at that conveying company, but Alcoa bought that conveying company and I didn't get along with the management team at all. They wanted to move the conveying company from Hollister, California to Sydney. And I told them that wasn't going to work because most of the people were Spanish American and Mexican Americans. And some of them couldn't even speak English. And I said, you can't move this company. They're not going to go. And they didn't care. And so that disagreement led to me in January of 1990 leaving and starting my own company. And so like I said, the rest is history. Ball Corporation gave me a number of opportunities. In the early 90s, we got an opportunity from Campbell Soup, and we changed everything in the food and packaging industry from three-piece cans. And if you're old enough, you remember that most of those cans used to have a lid on the bottom, a lid on the top, and a side seam. And it subjected that can to a lot of spoilage. And so we reinvented that and turned it into a two-piece where you only have a body and a lid. And we make it the same way when we make an aluminum beverage can. And that really springboarded us into a lot of opportunities with other people besides Ball. And eventually we started being and became I would say, the premier dominant player in the aluminum can industry. And a significant amount of my time was actually spent in Asia, especially China. I also spent a lot of time in Europe. And, that's kind of where I started seeing what was going on environmentally. And it scared me, having come from the pristine Alps of Austria to the rural areas of United States and always looking for wild places. Mm-hmm. I just started questioning, how long is it going to stay wild when we have the pressure on population like we've had. When I immigrated here, we had roughly 150 million. Now we're well over 300. Mm-hmm. And I've seen the kind of pressure that's put on our landscape for both wildlife and wild places and water. And, I don't just look at what's happening atmospherically. I keep saying the planet has a fever. And, what's creating that fever, a lot of things that we see as pressure on the resources that we all need to live the kind of life that we have here in America. Mm-hmm. The rest of the world wants that. And when I see the changes that happened in China from 1985 until today, it's staggering. And, unless we look at all the resources in the world and what role those resources are playing, I feel like, we have a finite set of temperatures and parameters that we can live in. And as we continue to change those, we're putting our planet under a lot of distress. And people that don't believe that, I think, are just not facing up to the fact that we are contributing to it. And we need to do a better job of figuring out how to, balance what we need with what the planet wants to give us so we can all survive.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, Rudi, what Roeslein Alternative Energy is big in the RNG space. I think this is a good segue. What influenced you to invest in renewable energy, specifically, RNG, after building, your successful global modular construction company? Why RNG?
Well, and I think, part of it is I had this good fortune of being in so many different countries and seeing what Europe was doing with renewable energy, and specifically with the renewable natural gas. In Europe, they were really pushing electricity, and they were taking raw gas, raw methane, and actually putting it into Genbachers. But I saw the impact that was having because of the hydrogen sulfide. When they treated the hydrogen sulfide, there were still issues with producing electricity and the value of that versus natural gas. But the main reason is, at age 65, I had been about 7, 8 years into an ESOP. My company is an employee-owned company. I started selling stock, and at the age 65, I had a significant amount of money from that ESOP, and I guess it could have went off into the sunset. In fact, I kind of entertained buying a big ranch in Colorado and just going and hide and not deal with all the pressure and problems of business. But I really felt my work was unfinished. I'd seen the cyclical nature of the can industry, and we'd almost, lost everything twice. In 2000, 2001, I didn't have any work for almost 2 years, and I carried all of my employees by innovating and coming in and smiling every day and challenging them to reconfigure our systems and make them more economical and more efficient and smarter. And we went from centralized control systems to distributive control systems. But I really felt, we would come out of that. And so I risked everything, and we did. But we've had, some other cycles. The last 2 years have been pretty rough again in the can industry because these companies all build out and then they kind of saturate the market, and then they have to wait for a few more years. So I thought, what are we going to do with all these people? And back in 2000, 2001, I had a little over 100 people. And 3 years ago, we were almost up to 1,500 people with operations in China and, and Brazil and Poland, the UK. And I felt a sense of responsibility to all those people to say, well, what happens? Are we going to do what our competitors did? They let all their people go whenever these cycles happen. And I just didn't want to do that. So I felt a sense of responsibility. And I had some opportunities prior to getting into the RNG space to build some ethanol plants, kind of at the tail end of that whole cycle with Abengoa. We built one in Illinois, we built one in Indiana, and that kind of led to, the renewable space a little bit. They wanted me to get involved in Hugoton, Kansas, but I looked at the complexity of enzymatic hydrolysis and became really concerned that there were too many things that were jumping from a laboratory to a small demo unit to a commercial system where there was no commercial equipment available. And as an integrator, I've always learned the weakest link is always something that has never been completely developed. And the more steps you have in a continuous process, if you have untested and equipment that's not available and everything becomes an experiment, it's a huge, huge risk. And Abengoa actually wanted us to do what we did in the ethanol space, and that's build a bunch of modular systems and unit sections that had piping and wiring. And at the end of the day, they also asked me to take on some process responsibility. And I said, no, it's not our process. In fact, I think it's not going to work. I think it's too complicated. I think, getting to a price point where you become economical is going to be extremely difficult on the first go around. And of course, history proved me right that, they did go bankrupt, and even DuPont stopped their project in Iowa. But I did see what was going on in Germany. And I saw, gee, the Germans have got this. It's simple. They're using anaerobic digestion. They're making renewable gas, which otherwise would go into the atmosphere. But I also thought that there's hundreds and maybe thousands of little farms that don't have enough animals or don't have enough waste to justify these costs. Scale is everything. When you look at the cost of an interconnect in the early days when we start dealing with Trans-Canadian Pipeline, we had to go to Calgary a number of times to convince them what we were doing. They were going to let us pipe into their gas pipeline with what? With animal waste gas. So it was a challenge, and it was $6 million for an interconnect. And then, the piping to get from our gas purification processes to the interconnect, if you had extensive miles, it's, a couple $100,000 per mile. So you have this scale requirement. But again, the main purpose was that I didn't feel like our can industry really could sustain our continuous growth without valleys and peaks. So I wanted 3 different legs on our stool, like a 3-phase electrical system. I wanted renewable energy, and then I always thought fossil fuel energy has to be around for a long time. Anybody that thinks we're going to go all electric is fooling themselves. It's just too expensive. We have a multi-trillion-dollar gas grid system that is so valuable. And in fact, I met with President Biden for 90 minutes this spring to try to convince him to let me talk to the DOE and to several other departments about the whole concept of trying to electrify our country or the world without natural gas. And I really believe we were heading for a major train wreck and putting ourselves in a similar situation to what Europe did with Russia. We have the most amazing gas grid security system in the world. And by building all these facilities to tie into it, we can have roughly 17% of our natural gas supplied by renewable energy just from animal waste, let alone all the other waste products that we produce in this country that we have to come to grips with. We can't keep filling up these waste and landfills, and sooner or later, all of those things have a life cycle. They're going to leach, and they're going to do things, and they're going to cause environmental issues. So we have to deal with waste. And I think making renewable natural gas, and as you've probably seen, we have some of the lowest CI scores in the industry. We're averaging in the minus 400s. There is no other source of electricity right now or energy that's doing that. Not wind, not solar. And those other sources of energy are fine, but they only provide electricity. Our concept is, and we'll get into the 3-dimensional Venn that I have, is we want to produce energy, but we also want to look at what are the ecological services that we can provide that have significant avoided costs to society of cleaning water and soil losses and providing habitats for our critical wildlife and our pollinators and even our butterflies. And, fortunately, I was able to get a grant with the prior Secretary of State, Tom Vilsack. He told me there was a grant application coming up. And, we call that grant Horizon 2. And it's an $80 million grant that is going to help promote our vision of how to produce energy and how to produce ecological services and have wildlife habitat all in one effort that is very, very symbiotic in how we look at things. It's not just providing energy, but we're also looking at how do we preserve the habitat and what habitat should we be using for food versus, cleaning up our water and our atmosphere and cooling our atmosphere. So it's a complicated process. I'm excited about it. Right now, it's temporarily being reviewed as all these grants are being reviewed, and I'm hoping that we get to go ahead again by the end of the month. We've already established over 5,000 acres of prairie grasses and over 1,000 acres of cover crops that we will be using as a source of energy and combining it. And if you look on our website, you'll see Horizon 2 USDA Climate Smart Commodities Grant. and all the partners, the wonderful partners in the universities and Nature Conservancy and many other conservation agencies that are helping provide technology and science to really measure what we're doing with this grant.
Mm-hmm. So interesting. Rudi, I'm going to ask you one more question for this podcast, and then we will end it. And just a side note to our listeners, there will be a feature article in the next issue of Biomass magazine continuing this conversation with Rudi. So this is just a sneak peek of what you will get. So Rudi, the last question we'll do for the podcast is, did you foresee the RNG industry becoming the sector that it is today, experiencing this incredible exponential growth, or did that come as kind of a surprise?
No, I have to say it's been a long and difficult road. Mm-hmm. I was introduced to this process because I had farms in northern Missouri, and I heard about the trials and tribulations of premium standard farms. They were being sued. Just a tremendous amount of money was being wasted in lawsuits. Mm. And I heard about at breakfast or sometimes at lunch when I was there, people talking about the fact that the mills were closing, and even in Unionville, the little health center had to close and people were being laid off. And I thought, well, why are we doing this? I mean, the Germans have a solution. Why are we litigating hundreds of millions of dollars instead of spending it on solutions? So I approached Smithfield, and it's been, almost 15 years ago. It was in 2011. And it took a couple of years to convince them. But the way I convinced them was I had a meeting with them, and they asked me how much of their money I wanted. I said, I don't want your money. I just want your shit. And so, they laughed at me and said, hey, give this fool our shit. But I spent $57 million proving at a number of the farms that what we were doing would actually work. But look, with the help of Angela Schwartz and Element Market, we provided the pathways. I mean, we spent 3 years getting a pathway with the EPA and then in the California market, and it was long and it was painful. I spent 7 years of that to spend that money to get these pathways, and we pioneered all this. Mm-hmm. So I wasn't busy thinking. I just felt like it was the right thing to do. I saw what the Germans were doing and the initiatives they were taking, the Europeans were taking. And I speak fluent German, and I asked these farmers, why are you doing this? They said, well, we want our kids to have something besides farming. They want to be in technology. They want to be green. They want to have something besides waking up before the sun comes up and working until sundown, being farmers. And this gave them a whole nother vertical. And so I didn't think about how big it was going to be. I just felt like it was the right thing to do. But I got to tell you, I mean, we had some terrible times. We've had viruses with the pigs where I had no animals to produce the manure that I wanted. In 2018, when I finally had animals, and we had a terrible storm that they weren't sure if it was tornadoes, but it wrecked most of the barns where I had my assets. So I left there pretty despondent that day, thinking, Jesus, I got another year of no income, and my partners think I'm crazy. My wife thinks I'm crazy. They're all thinking, why are you fooling around? You think your Rumpelstiltskin turning shit into gold. But it was tough. And then all of a sudden, we started the next year. We actually got Smithfield to participate. They became our partner. They anteed up their $57 million, and off we went. And since then, we've built over 200 lagoons all over the country. And
wow.
Almost 90 of them in Missouri, and we did Utah, we did Arizona, Texas, New Mexico. We've got projects in North Carolina and in Iowa, and we're still looking at significant projects in North Carolina and Iowa and Nebraska and other states that have these challenges. Mm-hmm. So did I know it was going to grow like that? No. But I did felt it was the right thing to do. And every morning I ask myself, and I ask employees, are we doing something that makes a difference? Mm-hmm. Are we just trying to make money? At this stage of my life and most of my life, I didn't want to just make money. I always wanted to be somebody that makes a difference in people's lives. Mm-hmm. I think we've done that with the package that we have. The aluminum can is the most recyclable package in the world. And it's such a safe, solid package that, in almost all countries, it can be transported well, it can be recycled, and it has value. And I wanted to be in something else that did the same thing. And I really felt this renewable gas industry was that. So, it's been almost a 15-year, I'll be 77, and I'm still working on Horizon 2 because I think that's the real solution. My dream is to restore 30 million acres of native grasslands around our streams and rivers and improve the quality of our water, prevent soil erosion. And, if we do this strategically, we can have significant impact on hypoxia. Iowa State has been a partner of mine, and they've helped. When you look at the amount of erosion that you have, typically, you have a tremendous amount of erosion, especially in Missouri. So if we just take 10% of a field and convert it into natives strategically, we can reduce 95% of the soil going into our streams and rivers. We can reduce phosphorus by 77% and nitrogen by 70%. So what is the avoided cost for society if we do that around 30 million acres? It's tremendous.
Right.
So that's my ultimate goal. This other stuff are just steps to get to that goal. And my Horizon 2 grant is kind of the proof analysis of that with the scientists that we have from Iowa State and Mizzou and Penn State. And we have help from, really smart people at the Nature Conservancy and several other conservation agencies. And I think it's a tremendous opportunity for our country to have distributed energy all over rural America and revitalize those rural communities that desperately need something besides corn and beans, especially now with these tariffs coming on. And I'm scared to see how that's going to affect the farmers if the Chinese reciprocate on our beans and other commodities and put a big tariff on them. So we're trying to establish a whole nother vertical of energy and ecological services and wildlife habitat for our farmers, and trying to figure out how can we monetize those things and how do we model them to show society the avoided costs to society in billions and billions of dollars that this would create.
Mm-hmm. Well, Rudi, this is surely a legacy one can hang their hat on. And, you're doing amazing things. I am going to end this podcast right now and we'll continue our conversation. But I want to thank you for coming on and telling our listeners more about the history of Roeslein and, what's in store.
Oh, thank you, Anna. I appreciate it. It's always nice to be able to tell your story to an audience that hopefully appreciates everything we've gone through and what we're still trying to do. Thank you.
Absolutely. And to our listeners, again, this podcast is a teaser for a lengthier story that will run in Biomass Magazine issue 2. So keep an eye open for that. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed this episode and we'll catch you later.